the programming that we have for you this evening. So you should all be muted as you come in, and if you're not, please mute yourself just to limit any noise interruptions. Yeah, so thanks everybody again. So tonight's program is part of Docomomo National's larger tour day event, which every year has a theme. And so this year, the theme is the 70s turn 50. And so, you know, that can be described as a decade for architectural design that could be characterized by many external forces that needed to be taken into consideration. Architecture during these years was responding to the cultural zeitgeist of political and social upheaval, the looming energy crisis, new advances in material and building technology, all while seeking to elevate egalitarian values, much like in earlier designs. So we have two examples tonight that we're going to explore that responded to such forces in their own ways that we'll be, you know, talking about later tonight after the videos. The two sites that we'll be seeing videos for include the George Wharton Pepper Middle School, built in 1973 in the southwest part of Philadelphia, and is one of the city's strongest examples of brutalist architecture, and today sits vacant and derelict, and its demolition looming on the horizon. The other site is Mira Nakashima's house and reception house, built in 1975, and was the last building to be designed and built by George Nakashima, Mira's father. So, you know, again, everybody should be muted if they're not already. We'll have Q&A following the videos. And so any questions that people have, we ask that you submit them in the chat if you're able, and we'll go through those towards the end with Bill and Michael. And so with that, I'd like to introduce our speakers, Bill and Michael, who are going to walk us. We're going to view their videos, and we'll chat with them a little bit after. So, you know, and so a little bit about what led us to choosing these two sites really hinged on the fact that we're all living through this pandemic. And so what could we do for tour day? And so we settled on these two sites that responded to what was going on in the 70s in two different ways, but in some ways, similar ways, in the context of Philadelphia modernism. And so we'll be exploring some of that tonight. And so additionally, we decided to find sites that maybe were a bit off the beaten path and not always as easily accessible by the general public. So I think that the two sites that we have really give us a great inside look into all of this. So before we dive into the videos, I just want to thank Bill and Michael for all of your time and effort for putting this content together. And I'd also like to thank Dan Macy, a fellow board member who really was instrumental in orchestrating a lot of this. And I just can't thank you all enough. I'd also like to thank Mira Nakashima for allowing us to come into her home and sharing her space with us. I'd also like to thank Zach Ponce, who captured the video and the photography for the two videos that we'll be enjoying this evening. So with that, why don't we kick things off, starting with the Pepper Middle School, is that right? All right, and then we'll follow that with the video with Mira Nakashima, and we'll have a little bit of a conversation with Bill and Michael and get into some Q&A. So again, thank you everybody for joining us tonight.
Getting there.
Howdy, folks. I'm Michael Bixler, board member of Docomomo Phil, and we're out here in the Eastwick section of Southwest Philadelphia to celebrate 1970s modernism for Tour Day. Behind me is George Pepper Middle School. We're going to take a tour, so watch your step and follow me.
George Pepper Middle School in Eastwick is not a building on most people's radar. The brutalist pile of rigid concrete geometry is set back a ways from the road, and it almost sinks into the periphery as one travels down 84th Street towards John Hines National Wildlife Refuge. It is a disorienting feat for such a big, commanding structure. To truly appreciate the school's powerful presence, you have to walk onto the campus and see the place up close. What is striking today is how muscular and even dignified the building still looks after a steady barrage of vandalism and 7 years of vacancy. Between 1967 and 1971, 30 new public schools were approved for construction in Philadelphia. Pepper Middle School was designed originally in 1968 by Texas-based architecture firm Caudill Rolette Scott, which had a national reputation for school design, and local engineering firm Ballinger Company, who has been in business since 1920. The original plan for Pepper was part of a large suburban-style development that was never completed. It won praise from the local chapter of the American Institute of Architects, as well as Progressive Architecture magazine. However, the original plan was panned by the Philadelphia Art Commission for, quote, lacking the humanity element, and, quote, being entirely too concentrated. Construction was stalled for 2 years. Another row with the Art Commission in 1973 delayed the project even further, and the school didn't officially open until 1976. The school's namesake, George Wharton Pepper, was a lawyer, a law professor at the University of Pennsylvania, a Christian activist, and a Republican politician. He represented Pennsylvania in the United States Senate and founded the law firm of Pepper Hamilton. Former Mayor Michael Nutter and the School District of Philadelphia closed Pepper in 2013, following the vote to shutter 23 other public schools across the city. Pepper Middle School served over 400 5th through 8th grade students, of which over 80% live below poverty level.
So as I mentioned before, Pepper Middle School has been abandoned for about 7 years. The School District of Philadelphia closed 21 public schools in 2013. And although the building has sat vacant, vandalized, completely underutilized, there has been one kind of silver lining, and that is that it served as a canvas for all this incredible graffiti. Every year, every month, there's more and more layers of color, which is kind of jarring to see on such a muscular building in the brutalist style, but it works. It enlivens the facade. It really shows that the building is still alive and still has potential.
And then there's the trash. Old mattresses, piles of clothes, and mountains of used car tires. In 2018, the Philadelphia Streets Department removed over 26 tons of garbage and 65 tons of used tires. To make matters worse, the entirety of the Pepper parcel is listed as a FEMA special flood hazard area, and it sits 2 feet below sea level. The building is also contaminated with asbestos and mold.
This is what I mean about the illegal dumping. I was here in 2018 to shoot a photo essay for Hidden City, Philadelphia, and the tire situation was out of control as it is now. Contacted the streets department, who promptly came and removed what I had mentioned before, at least 1,000 tires. And over time, it all collects again. And it's kind of a Sisyphean effort to stop people from illegally dumping at the school when the school isn't being used. So along with used tires, there's a lot of illegal dumping of household items like televisions, other appliances, mattresses, you name it. The city can only monitor the school so much, but it does get to the point where it becomes a little out of control.
Let's talk about the misperceptions of brutalism, the whole authoritarian versus idealism debate. The term brutalism comes from the French béton brut, or raw concrete, as opposed to the literal word for suffering, brutal. The term brutalism was coined by Swedish architect Hans Asplund in 1949. British architectural historian Rainer Banham popularized the term in his 1955 essay, The New Brutalism. However, the term quickly evolved into a literal interpretation of the style and has since become a derogatory term. There's this preconceived notion that brutalist buildings were designed to be menacing, authoritarian, and prohibitive, like a fortress, a bunker, a prison. But modernist architects at the time didn't see it this way at all. This is civic-minded architecture. Brutalist buildings were designed with an eye towards progress and a more equitable future while being relatively inexpensive to build. Hence all that concrete, raw, honest, unpretentious. The ornamentation of Victorian architecture spoke of wealth, exclusivity. Poor people are not welcome. On the other hand, modernism, and specifically brutalism, spoke of utility and equity. Everybody is welcome. One of Le Corbusier's 5 points of architecture is a house is a machine for living in. Pepper Middle School is a machine for learning and socializing. It was built to serve and protect students. Architects and administrators at the time praised these new school buildings as celebrations of their communities. As public schools might be a neighborhood's only major civic institution, advocates of the new building program promoted the importance of their increased visibility. These new brutalist schools stood out from the repetition of rectangular volumes that made up the modern urban grid, especially in a row house city like Philadelphia. The disconnect between architectural intention and public perception has plagued brutalist buildings from the very beginning. Even legendary modernist Louis Kahn commented on the increasing resemblance of public schools to prisons. A former member of the Philadelphia Art Commission, Kahn particularly criticized the lack of light afforded by many of the new public schools designed during this era. Like it or hate it, George Pepper Middle School is one of the finest examples of brutalism in Philadelphia. Other terrific examples include the Police Administration Building, aka the Roundhouse, Paley Library at Temple University, International House and the Walnut 32 parking garage at the University of Pennsylvania, the Municipal Services Building across from City Hall, and the Northeast Regional Library branch of the Free Library of Philadelphia, among many others. As far as land goes, Eastwick is one of the biggest neighborhoods in Philadelphia. It was the target of the biggest urban renewal plan in the United States, spearheaded by city planner Edmund Bacon. However, the plan was an epic flop and much was left undone. Today, there are streets to nowhere and cul-de-sacs where houses were never built. In the early 20th century, Eastwick was a collection of smaller rural communities known as Elmwood, the Meadows, the Lowlands, Tinicum, Little Holland, and Clearview. It was essentially marshland as it is today. Before urban renewal, it was an integrated community of Italians, Irish, Asians, African Americans, and European Jews living in relative racial harmony. In 1950, Bacon and city officials certified the area as blighted, allowing them to embark on their plan to create a city within a city in Eastwick. The plan involved large-scale eminent domain. Despite widespread opposition to the redevelopment scheme, officials pushed ahead. The city condemned and demolished hundreds of homes. Between 1940 and 1970, the population in Eastwick dropped by 2/3, from 3,625 residents to 1,126. There are a number of current issues surrounding the building and the neighborhood. The Lower Eastwick Public Land Strategy, the Neighborhood Master Plan, was recently released by the Redevelopment Authority. 190 acres of land are on the table. There have been talks for years about a possible airport expansion, which the neighbors are not in favor of. Community development, senior housing, workforce development, these are the residents' top priority. The neighborhood is also a food desert. Easy access to transit is a big challenge, and there has been a considerable amount of commercial disinvestment in recent years. The School District of Philadelphia handed Pepper over to the Redevelopment Authority after backing out of a sale of the school to a local church in 2017. Sadly, the Lower Eastwick Public Land Strategy Plan recommends the demolition of Pepper Middle School. Finally, let's talk about adaptive reuse and healing the community through a progressive vision for the future. Before the school closed, the Eastwick Friends and Neighbors Coalition, Friends of Hines Refuge, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and the Pepper Middle School administration advocated for keeping the school open. Their proposal called for the transformation of the school into a shared facility that includes Pepper Middle School, a STEM high school for environmental sciences and sustainability, and a community learning center for adult education. The Philadelphia Orchard Project, whose mission it is to plant orchards in the city of Philadelphia that provide healthy food, green spaces, and community food security, partnered with the Urban Nutrition Initiative and began planting apple, Asian pear, cherry, Juneberry, and fig trees in a 40 by 80 foot patch of land next to the auditorium. Raised vegetable beds were also established. There were plans for berry bushes, including blueberries, raspberries, honeyberries, plus perennials and ground cover plants, and eventually a grape and kiwi arbor. The food was to go to volunteers and food donations to a local church. My personal vision for the future of Pepper is to use the massive school to help make the community whole again through adapting the building into a neighborhood hub by installing a food co-op or grocery store, a social services and health center, a public library, a recreation center, an arts and performance space, a trade school, and a daycare center. But the possibilities are endless. Mid-century modern buildings, and specifically brutalist buildings, are being destroyed globally, much to the concern of historians, preservationists, and architects. Can we see beyond the cliches of authoritarian aggression and view buildings like Pepper Middle School as highly functional architecture that can serve the community again?
So that concludes the tour. Thanks for joining us for Tour Day 2020. If you're not already a member of Docomomo Phil, please consider joining. And remember, modernism matters.
All right.
Yeah, so we're here at the Nakashima Studios, and it is October, and it's annual tour day for Docomomo. And I'm Bill Whitaker. I'm a curator at the University of Pennsylvania at the Architectural Archives, and I'm here with Mira Nakashima, who's a good friend, somebody who I've known for almost 30 years now. And I've been fortunate to bring groups up here for a good long time, and it's always a pleasure to be here. And so today we're seeing a building that we usually don't get to see, which is Mira's house, and that's what you see right here. And we also have the joy of actually having Mira here to tell us a little bit about it, and where we are, and the history of this place. So hello, Mira.
Hi, Bill, again.
Nice to see you.
Been seeing a lot of Bill a lot of these days because of the Shofusa Modernism
Yeah.
exhibition and activities that didn't happen, the virtual activities that we invented instead. And so welcome to my house, which is not usually open to the public. My father started building it, bought this piece of property across from the studio in the late 60s, and decided to build me a house as a bribe to come home in 1970. So we, the house wasn't finished when we decided to move here. We lived in the Konoe studio for a while this house was, had the floors put in and things like that. And I had 3 small children at the time. It's just a miracle that nobody fell down the steps or fell off the porch very often. So we lived many happy years here. My husband and I still live here, and the children, of course, are all gone. But there are basically three bedrooms in this building. And then my grandmother, after my grandfather died, used to travel around to visit each of her 4 children during the year, and she would come and visit, and she came to visit, and Dad built this house for my grandmother in 1972 or so.
Yeah.
So it's kind of interesting. It's the same structure as the reception house, which we will see later. It's a scissors truss construction, both of the little buildings, and it's combined with reinforced concrete. As you can see, this porch here is contiguous with the understructure of this building. It has the subfloor made into the floor. So the 3x8s are laid flat and side to side, and they run the whole length of the building. So there is no space between the real space between the basement and the upper floor.
We're across from Aquatone Road from where the studios are. So you actually grow up on the other side of the street.
This is true.
And so your dad had bought this property in 1960. You were studying and working as an architect over in Japan at the time, right?
Yeah, I graduated from college in 1963, and then I went to Japan to study. So I was there until 1966. And then we lived in Pittsburgh for 3 years. I didn't come back here till 1970s.
So were you a part of the design process for this house? Did you sit down at the drafting table with your dad or at the table to talk about it? Or did he just do what he wanted to do?
He basically did what he wanted to do. When it got to the details like lighting fixtures and plumbing fixtures and stuff, he have a little bit of input, but
Right.
the rest of it was already a done deal. I didn't have much choice.
And in terms of the construction of this house, who was building it? I mean, I think a lot of people might have the impression that your dad was out here on the construction site building everything.
Well, he probably was here almost every day, but one of our older workmen, Robert Lovett, was mostly the builder in charge.
And he had built a lot of the buildings on site.
He worked on almost every single building across the road.
Yeah, and so across the road, we're talking, there's 15 buildings over there, and this is the one on the other side of the street.
Right.
Is it far enough away from work? Do you feel like you can get enough away from what's going on across the way?
Oh, definitely. Yeah,
Uh-huh.
it's very nice. I really like the commute, although Aquatone Road is getting so busy, sometimes I have to wait a long time to get across the street.
Right, sure. In the structure of your house, your dad's using a scissor truss.
Yes.
And so that creates a lower roof area, which is the ceiling within the living areas of the house. And then there's a higher pitched, which is the exterior space. Tell me about the scissor truss and why your dad was interested in that.
Well, I think, being an architect, he was always interested in different ways of spanning space. And he must have been into his scissors. He was doing shelves for a while, different kinds of shelves across the road. And somehow he got interested in scissors trusses. And my house was probably the first practice model for the reception house, which happened later. And then after my house was built, he built another smaller structure, which also has a scissors truss roof. And this is the practice model. Just he thought it was a neat way of spanning space, and you get the sort of eccentric roof line, which he enjoyed. We're walking off into the sunset.
So we've crossed Aquatone Road and we're now over on the main part of the Nakashima studios. Mira's house is across the way. And you can hear the drone of the shop, which is just behind us here. But we're standing in front of the family house. This is your first home, in a sense, here on the property, at least permanent. And so this is the house that your dad started building in what, about 1946?
About 1940. I was about 5, 1947, maybe 46, 47.
Yeah.
Yes.
And there's some really beautiful shots of you helping your dad build the house, right?
This was definitely a hand-built George Nakashima house. He did everything from the concrete blockwork to the stonework to the plumbing and the electrical wiring. And they didn't have enough money for purchasing insulation, so there was a cavity between the inside and outside walls that he filled with sawdust as insulation. And when they redid the house, the original house had poured concrete. The original house had poured concrete tiles, which my father poured himself and laid as the first roof. And in the mid 1970s, it started leaking so badly they built the second roof over it, which is the roof that you now see. There's still the concrete tiles underneath there somewhere. But the roof, the slats in the front covered the cistern. We didn't have enough money to drill a well at that point, so we collected rainwater for washing in the cistern underneath that slanted roof.
Okay, so we're we're now at the reception house, and this is George Nakashima's last building, and he really saw it as an opportunity to bring together a lot of ideas with respect to design and construction and architecture in one building. And so, Mira, why don't you tell us a little bit about why did he need to build this? Why this building, besides really getting to test oneself once again with the challenge of architecture?
Well, I think Dad realized he was getting older, and he was working on the project, which is the biggest project we've ever done, furnishing the Junzo Yoshimura Japanese house up at the Botanical Hills for Nelson Rockefeller. So I think he had money in the bank, and he decided he had money in the bank, time to build another building. And when I was growing up, Dad would have parties, Dad and Mother would have parties, and there was no real place that was set up for entertaining, and there was no dishwasher on the property. So Dad decided he would use the finest materials available to him to make this building. And so he imported plaster from Japan. It's called Kyokabe. And he used very fine materials in the floors, and he wanted to have a Japanese bath. So he had a local person build a Japanese bath. And he also realized that in the 1970s, we were going to encounter a fossil fuel usage crisis. And he built this building that would be of sustainable materials and use sustainable materials to heat it and to heat the bathtub. And we have plenty of scrap wood. So there's a big fireplace inside that heats the entire building. The Japanese bath is heated by a Japanese wood-burning boiler he imported from Japan. And it also had an electric dishwasher and a full set of dishes, so we didn't have to lug the dishes around and wash them in different places on the property. So it was his and Mother's favorite place for dinner parties in his later years.
Okay, so we've come inside the reception house here. We entered in, and there's this kind of traditional, almost Genkan, where you're able to take off your shoes. And I love how your father incorporated the windowsill is actually the bench. So he's making really nice, efficient use of space. And the floor there is slate, right?
It's slate, and it's got radiant proof under it.
Oh, that's very nice. So it's a very nice welcoming, feel when you take your shoes off and you come in. And so then when you come in, there's this amazing floor, right? There's some planks here that are almost look like 14, 18 inches wide. Some are thin, like 2 or 3 inches. What's this floor? What's the floor made out of?
Well, Dad said he always had to keep building because he had lumber that wasn't good enough to make furniture, but it was fine for doing floors with. And this is bloody birch. The lighter planks are bloody birch, and the darker planks are walnut, and they are completely random width, random length, and it is like a jigsaw puzzle putting them together.
But it's pretty magnificent, huh?
Yeah, no, it's pretty nice floor.
So the space that we're in, it's, everything is basically in one room, right? So that there's an eating area, there's a sitting area, there's a place right next to the fireplace. There's a beautiful little window seat with shoji screens that can open, and then also a little corner desk that's quite charming. So, so then also there's some other details that are in this space. The basic living areas are all in one room.
Yeah.
So the ceiling, we're seeing the underside of the scissor truss. So we have these wonderful columns that are kind of in the middle of the house, it seems, and that you can see one beam that's thicker connecting with 2 beams that are thinner, and then they overlap in the center, right? So that's the scissor idea, right?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, very elegant. So why the red color? What's the red color about?
Oh, I think that's a nod to Pennsylvania barns.
So like the redware of the dishes and the red of the barns. Really beautiful. And then we also see the connections. There's bolts there, right? I mean, I think a lot of people imagine Japanese traditional architecture don't use bolts. Your dad used bolts, right?
He did, but he also used Japanese joints. I think the beam over there has a Japanese joint.
Yeah. So then the fireplace, it's substantial. I mean, it feels almost overscaled for the room, but it's doing quite a bit, right? It's more than just a fireplace.
Well, it heats the entire building. It has a plenum behind it and a fan system. to improve the efficiency of the fire.
Yeah.
It's built like a Franklin stove, so it has a metal hood. And he envisioned that, you know, at one point, if you got enough fire going in there, you could actually cook on the hood of the fireplace. He also has a little pocket on the side where you could use as an oven if you got to.
You bake some bread.
Yes, if the oven was, if the fireplace was hot enough.
Yeah. So, but then there's an extraordinary Japanese room in here. So tell us about that.
It's a 4.5 mat room, which is kind of traditional small tea ceremony room in Japan. And I think he thought of it as, well, it's the only almost traditional Japanese room on the property. It has a tatami mat floor, and it has the Japanese plaster wall.
But then there's the extraordinary bathtub that's in this place. That's the most fun bathtub I've ever seen in my life.
Oh.
What was your dad thinking?
I don't
You don't know?
No, Dad never told me what he was thinking, but he did invite each of my children, who were quite young at the time, to make little designs that he would have the tile craftsman put into the bathtub and the floor around the bathtub. And he used Japanese penny round tiles to give them some kind of flexibility for executing those designs.
Yeah. So usually when we do tours, we're not able to really focus on fine grain detail. There's usually too many people in the space, and people are taking a lot in. And so I wanted to take this opportunity to focus a little bit more on something as simple as a handle. Mm-hmm. And this is actually a bookcase. You know, there's some storage for pottery and other household objects, but this handle right here and the cabinet that goes with it, let's talk a little bit about this handle. You know, because when it comes to design, the place where a designer actually, you know, knows that someone's going to touch and engage with it. You know, what does that mean? What do you think about as a designer when you're challenged with a handle?
Well, in this particular building, he wanted to use the finest materials available to him because I think he realized this would probably be his last building. And to him, the English oak burl was very, very precious. He had gone to England himself and purchased some logs and brought them back. And he said the Queen of England should have stolen crown jewels and kept those logs, but he got the logs. So this is one of the last remnants of the English oak burl log that he purchased.
And so what is a burl? What does a burl do?
A burl is an unusual growth pattern in a tree. There have been many different theories about why they grow. Sometimes it's an insect infestation. Sometimes it's genetic aberration. Sometimes it's the tree trying to regrow after a forest fire. There are many different reasons for burling.
So are we looking at something that would have been vertical in a tree or horizontal?
I think it's probably vertical because you can see the sap grain along the edge where the tree was growing and the heart was darker.
Yeah. So we're going to go in and we're going to open up the kitchen, right? So
You have to get that thing out of the way first.
yeah. I really love these handholds that you just put your finger in and you can just set it here.
I think that's a holdover from Randolph.
I think so.
Yeah.
So then we're able to push this in.
Slide that in. Yep.
And then the second. And then third. Oops, I got stuck.
All right.
And then number 4. Put the door back. Very clever. And then there we have it. We've got a kitchen.
Yay.
So let's talk about this magnificent table. So just tell me about it.
Well, I guess Dad decided that the space needed a table sort of this size, and he happened to have 2 adjacent planks of a beautiful English walnut tree that he also got from England, and very unusual in its coloration. Usually, English walnut is not this dark; it's almost as dark as ebony. And so he put it together and he came up with this shape, which is a beautiful shape. If you're sitting around the table, it's sort of roundish, but it's not totally round. And I believe this was the prototype peace altar, which came a few years after he made this table. He called it the Sanso table, and it is only 5 feet, approximately 5 feet long. So there's one single support underneath. When he got to making the peace altars, they were 4 times the size. So he needed a little more support. But it's a wonderful way to bring people together around a table. And someone was saying that the shape is, it's not a perfect round, so it represents the way peace is made around the world, irregularly shaped and uneven, and it has lots of flaws and needs fixing and polishing and shaping, and that's the way mine is. But it's a lovely table. It does, when you're actually having a dinner party here, it's a long way to reach to the other side of the table.
Yes, you use
So we use a lazy Susan. But
So just explain to me so this piece of wood was on top of this one, or,
Yes.
or vice versa.
either way, they were just adjacent planks.
Yeah.
Long.
So it's just opened up, and that's a butterfly, or what is it? Or what? A book, it's a book match. Yeah, I was mixing it up with
Yeah, the butterfly.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. And then so, when you rub your hand across here, you can see there's actually a lot of movement in the surface.
Yeah, it didn't come out when the planks dry. They don't always dry flat. And those are the saw marks that were there. We just sand them down.
Yeah.
I didn't want to lose the thickness completely. So he left that sort of rough spot there.
Yeah. I mean, one thing I've always admired about this table is it's a little bit lower.
Yes, it is.
And in terms of how you're talking about people coming together and making people feel like they come together, it's actually lower to your legs.
Mhm.
So you feel like you're actually closer to other people than other dining tables. At least that's how I've always felt sitting here.
Yes, yeah, that's true.
And I'm sure that's intended,
No,
right?
especially for short people like us. it's
Okay. I'm
okay.
not a 6 foot taller. Yeah. Yeah. Really beautiful. This has been a wonderful visit, Mira. Thank you for having us here. And I know that a lot of people are thinking about, visiting places like that, being in places like this. And we just want to thank you for opening these places up and sharing them with us today. Thanks.
Thank you very much for leading the tour.
All right. That was wonderful. Both videos, both very different places. I think what is most striking to me is they're responding to very similar sort of issues in some ways in the 1970s, but in very different ways. And what's most striking to me is the materiality of the two sites and how they come together. And the visual impacts that they have are both very different. So, maybe Bill and Michael, if you two want to talk a little bit about what you read from the two buildings, particularly in the context of 1970s modernism in Philadelphia, and the context in which they were designed and built.
Sure. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is optimism. Right, Bill?
Yeah.
So with Pepper, as I mentioned in the video, it almost was before urban renewal, kind of a rural utopia. Culturally, lots of different ethnicities cohabitating in this large, kind of verdant marshland. And then the city comes in with their utopian vision for a city within a city, and more or less demolishes everything in sight to see their vision of a smaller utopian city within a larger city with problems. They wanted to kind of start over and use it, in a way as kind of an incubation for how to advance and make things better for other neighborhoods in Philadelphia. And then you have Pepper Middle School, which finally was built in the 70s. And, the scale of the place is enormous. And it was built like that for an anticipated population, so a raised population, a population growth in the area. But the communities, the existing communities who, did stay, were not really, the investment didn't happen in the neighborhood. And so the school, served a fraction of the students that it really was intended to serve. And so once the school was closed in 2013 by Mayor Nutter, this kind of utopian vision deferred reached its final hour. And the reason why I picked it is because it has so much potential. The embodied energy in the building itself, just for practicality reasons, the amount of fossil fuels that went into building it and the amount of fossil fuels that will go into destroying it or demolishing it and clearing the site are, will have a very large impact. And given the amount of space and given that, again, it's this embodied energy just sitting there waiting to be used, waiting to be repaired. The basement's flooded. There are a lot of downsides to reusing the building, and money is certainly a factor, but I really do think that, a forward-thinking vision for the future could really heal some wounds in Eastwick and, pursue this idea of, a quote unquote urban utopia,
For me, for both these projects is this idea that, you really can change the world through a building, or at least the ambition. And that was one of the great kind of forces behind modernism in the first place, coming out of the late 19th century and World War I, that, one had to figure out a different way of doing that. And just it felt like a lot of what was going on in the world was failing. And so the modern architects and artists brought this incredible energy into rethinking the world around us. And that flowed into all kinds of places, but particularly schools and houses, become really interesting examples of how you try to actually make that work, how you come to grips with manifesting it for real. Building is one thing, but to actually press it into people's hearts, if you will, and to make that kind of wonderful connection. And it was really interesting for me to hear Mira talk about the table in the reception house as kind of, at first that project, the reception house, was a way for George to create a place for his family to come together, for special clients to come together. It was kind of a party house. But the incidental thing that comes out of that is this kind of idea of a table, a peace table. And it's just in this kind of simple gesture of the shape of a table being resonant with how you make things happen, how you make human connections happen. And that, it's almost like he backed into a utopian ideal, whereas with Pepper, they were going full guns to, to try and invest in making the world a better place. And in the one case, it seems like maybe it failed. And in the other, from the human dimension, it seems to continue to grip us. It's interesting that's, part of our modernism. It's part of modernism in its root, but in our area, to see these two examples, however disparate they are, kind of wonderfully resonating with their times.
Oh, that's great. So we have a couple of questions coming through in the chat, which I can read off for you guys. So the first one, Bill, is for you, from Alex Rivera, asking if, so he understands that the Nakashima residence is currently closed to tours due to the pandemic, and is wondering if there is an email list that will notify when tours are available again.
Yeah, I think one signs up for the tours of the Nakashima studio through George Nakashima Woodworkers, but they have suspended their tours for the foreseeable future. They are, like many other, institutions, they've got to focus on certain essentials, and making furniture is the essential activity there. That's also the place where Mira and her family live. Her brother Kevin, who we're thinking of tonight, is also lives on the campus. And so in order to keep that primary activity, everyone healthy, they're kind of focusing in on essentials. So the hope is that's something that maybe next summer, we're just gonna have to play it by ear. So yeah, stay tuned.
All right, thanks, Bill. All right, so here's a question from Mick Risorito. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing that, regarding the Pepper School. So the question is, were there any innovations in the classroom planning or internal organization that looked towards a new way of learning or school life / community?
Hey, Mick. I do not know. I've never read anything about applications of the educational process at Pepper that would be any different than what, lots of public schools, but especially Philadelphia, was experimenting with in the 1970s. So no specific programming. I believe that some public schools began dabbling in agriculture and stuff in the 70s, but again, I'm not familiar with anything that would stand out from your typical 1970s public school educational programs. But I would like to know as well.
Now, I might just add, I don't know specifics about Pepper, but a lot of architects are exploring ways to bring people together, bring students together in new ways. And so one would look to the plan of the building. The architects, Claudel, Rolla, and Scott, are major architects that are doing schools all over the country. And so it probably has to do with what you bring into a school. I mean, I know with William Penn High School, which is another building from the similar period as Pepper, that has been demolished on North Broad Street. That it was to bring all the incredible amenities into the public school system in Philadelphia, including TV studios, world-class swimming pools, and things like that. And so it became this kind of monster in terms of budget and things like that, and somehow still was disconnected from the world around it in a way that it didn't prove successful. So, but there's lots of great scholarship and people who've looked at some of the shortcomings of the idealism and the realities of the day. So save it for the next tour.
And so keeping with Pepper, Jessica Labowitz asked if, Michael, she's curious if you have gotten a student's perspective of attending school there.
I haven't personally, though a few times through Hidden City's Instagram, when I posted pictures of Pepper. I frequent Pepper. I'm both on my way to John Hines Wildlife Refuge, and sometimes I just check in on it to make sure the building's doing okay. It hasn't caught on fire, or slight obsession, but I think it's a healthy one. But I have had people who have gone to school there respond to our posts, and most of it's pretty positive. A lot of people reminisce about their time there as being a good experience. So it's ironic that a lot of people see the school and their first impression is, Jesus, it looks like a prison, whereas a lot of the the individuals who went there that have responded to social media posts really actually, the ones at least that I've read and have interacted with, have had a positive experience there. And we're talking about people from the 70s and 80s and 90s. I'm not really sure what the school felt like and what issues were there in 2013 before it closed, but mostly I've heard positive experiences, and it's really cool to hear people's impressions of what it was like going to school there.
Yeah, I can only imagine what it must have been like moving through those spaces, just moving from class to class. It just, unlike my high school experience, it did not look like a building like that. Very one of a kind. Yeah.
A lot of people liken it to the school outside of Chicago that was used for the Breakfast Club. So, and yeah, for what that's worth.
So Dan Macy asks, or he puts out there that a lot of people think that brutalist architecture is ugly and not inviting to habitation. Your thoughts?
You got a couple hours? I'll just say very quickly that it's all upon perception. One way is to look at brutalist buildings, particularly like the Roundhouse, the police administration building, as being kind of this large scale sculpture. I mean, it's, a lot of these buildings, because of their scale and because of, as I mentioned, kind of like rigid geometry, of course they look menacing when you think of what's quaint, like Thomas Kincaid paintings and little cottages, and that's the American, typical American vision of somewhere pleasant and acceptable architecture, I guess. But brutalism can be viewed as sculptural and as these kind of towering, word that gets thrown around as heroic landmarks, and there's a sculptural element to the kind of wide architectural style of brutalism that I think gets lost on people because they just see it as imposing, and a lot of people have to go to court, and where do they go to court? Usually in a 1970s building built in the brutalist style, or or jail, like the Roundhouse. And so they have negative connotations, but they're municipal buildings, and at that time, concrete was, a very affordable material to use, and in fashion,
I would add to what Michael is saying and just remind us that a lot of modern architects were thinking about monumentality, and we're thinking about how to think differently in terms of getting people to think about civic spaces, and the idea of having a marble-clad, elegant box with classical details with a great flight of steps, and that's the ennobling impulse of the Beaux-Arts, or the drawing on what comes in the past, and thinking of new ways to allow people access into services and things that are essential to democracy, and that you can completely rethink that, and that the modern material of concrete, could offer a kind of big boned, expressive means of communicating ideals of civic space, glass, a sense of openness, but that it in a way that you can see these different pieces and parts coming together as a way of breaking down the barriers or the mystery of government, if you will, or other ideas. There's also this idea, I think, that is helpful in keeping in mind is that stripping away of associations with the past, in a sense, trying to free us up to a new future. It's part of that idealism and kind of, leaving some baggage behind, in a sense. I think many architects can find ways of of engaging with what comes before without copying what comes before. And the effort amongst modern architects to go to concrete was a surefire way to make sure that you looked different at the very least. Architecture still counts a lot on, you know, the sensibilities of proportion, of human engagement, and how you get somebody to feel a sense of inspiration in engaging with the building. And that's not easy to do. But I admire the idea of architects committing themselves to trying to make it work differently. Materials are a great way of doing that. So, you know, the idea that ostentation, you know, can be a way of inhibiting engagement. I think the brutalists were trying to find a way around that. And some of them were incredibly successful. There's some buildings that you get, others are just tough, you know.
Well, and along those lines, I often think about the cycle of taste and wonder what we may think of them in 25, 50 years from now, if people will view them differently and feel differently as a result. You know, hoping that many of these make it that long, since they seem so at risk because they are so hated today. And Bill, your comment about the materiality and scale and engaging with the human scale, just to me brings up the Philadelphia School and how that was just a big component of what they designed, just to bring it back local. So, and how the efforts that the designers here in the city were going through to connect with people in the buildings that they were putting up in our city. All right, so what do we have here? Okay, so Dan Macy again asked Bill if you can explain the Peace Table project and its goals.
Sure. Well, George Nakashima in the late 60s, early 70s, you know, had been doing a great, you know, he was trained as an architect, gave himself over through, you know, an experience of an ashram in India in the late 30s, early 40s, to engaging in more deep ways in actually making furniture. So he kind of shifted away from architecture, although in a way he always stayed an architect. But he did a number of church projects and furnishings within church spaces. He did a church in Japan, in Katsura. He did church out in Abiquiu in New Mexico out of adobe. You couldn't imagine George Nakashima working in adobe, but he did. And so there was a spiritual component in his work, and it's an important aspect of his work. And so he was drawn to how you evoke that in making furniture, and recognizing that the experience of standing before a great tree as it's a living thing can be as spiritually evocative. And then you can imagine after a great tree has lived out its life and has fallen, you could make something out of that carries forth that, you know, the marks of that that experience. You know, I mean, you know, Michael was talking about embodied energy, you know, the growth of a tree and all the marks and its characteristic of growth over hundreds, if not sometimes longer, you know, can still communicate to us into the future, even though it's no longer a living thing. It's given itself over to something else. And so why not make out of one great tree a series of tables, altars, as he called them, peace altars that could be put forth into the world on every continent, right? And there was no tree big enough to do this when he really got down to it, but he used one great tree taken out of, I think, Pennsylvania to make the first two. There's one at St. John the Divine in New York. There's one in Russia. There's one in India. And at the Arts Building in Cloister at the Nakashima Studios, there's the makings for the next one, which is a great book matched piece of Claro walnut from California. It's a massive 13, 14 foot long piece that's about 5.5. So it would make a massive table. So it's a pretty interesting experience. He did one table at the Arts Building in the 60s, and it's these two pieces of one tree. The other one is actually in a temple complex in Japan, in Takamatsu. And I've had the chance to sit at both tables. And it's like sitting with a twin, somebody that you know really well, or a cousin, it's like, somebody and then you're with their cousin. And there's this wonderful kind of echo of experience that comes out of that animates. And it's aimed at what within humanity, what are things that can bring us together and that we can gather around, that we all, in a sense, can speak to. And that's a pretty interesting message even today.
Yeah, absolutely. So Andrea asks if, Bill, you can tell us about the exhibit that was mentioned that I think you and Mira had mentioned during the video.
Yeah, so this is Shofuso and Modernism. It's an exhibition that has been on view since September. It's at the Japanese House and Garden in Fairmount Park until November 29th. After this weekend, Shofuso is just going to be open on Saturdays and Sundays. So there's only about 14 more days that you can go see the show. And it looks at the Japanese house, which is actually a commission of the Museum of Modern Art in the mid-1950s, and the artistic interconnections between Japan and the United States that are, as seen through a group of artists who worked really closely together, including Nakashima, but also Junzo Yoshimura and Antonin and Noemi Raymond. So there's a photographic component, and what Mira was referring to is a photographer colleague, Elizabeth Filicella, and I were up at Nakashima Studios and Raymond Farm about 30 times between May and August, basically photographing these three sites together. So we did extensive photography at the Nakashima Studios, Raymond Farm, and also at Shofuso. So go out and see the show. It was exciting that I could actually have an exhibition project that could get done and on view during this time of COVID.
Thanks, Bill. So turning back to brutalism, from Beth Tywater, she wrote, "Brutalist architecture seems like an appropriate reaction to the destruction of World War II, and perhaps economically is sensible."
You're right on. Again, as we're talking about concrete, as opposed to wood, brick, other traditional, marble, other traditional construction materials, it gained popularity because of how easy it was to make and pour and how cheap it was. And, I think Bill spoke very eloquently about, kind of the idealism coming out of the war and the ideas that were put into modernist architecture and behind the ideas of, civic architecture, an architecture for everyone, transparency through, heavy use of glass. Yeah.
Yeah, I would just add to that, the architecture of the post-war era is coming out of a time of rising of nationalistic times. The Nazis, the fascists in Italy and Spain, and a lot of them made reference to classical form. Maybe it was stripped down. I mean, it's even in our country. I mean, it's one of the limitations. Paul Cray is one of our great artist architects, and his work is powerful and moving. But the stripped back classicism, made certain things vague, and it was very useful for totalitarian rulers, and so finding ways to move away and express a more open sense of connection amongst peoples become important. So again, it's this process of stripping things back and getting beyond these kind of layers that get put before people that become impediments to connection. It's an inspiring thing to see, what the United States government tried to do in building the American embassies in the post-war era, and how they were trying to find a way to communicate values of democracy and openness out into the world. And it's really worth looking at some of the American embassies by Ed Stone in India, Ralph Rapson, Saarinen, and others. They're not always all successful, but they can be pretty fascinating things that start to give a sense of the range and dimension of how this architecture is supposed to be connecting and working. So.
All right, so we have a couple more questions here. So Joseph Gallagher asks, do you think there are examples from the present that are as idealistic as they are revolutionary in their form as these two examples?
I think of I went to architecture school, and one of my classmates, Brian Phillips, he still works in the city of Philadelphia, which just makes him, that's a commitment. And I think there's an idealism to that. And the idea that, you can do $100,000 house, right? That for that money, which is not nothing, but you can make something substantial with, modest funds. And that kind of sense of idealism is important, right? I think one part of the Nakashima Mira's house that I cut out in the interest of time, because I didn't, the video for Nakashima's was a bit too long, was looking at the back of her house where her dad is just using the dumbest of dumb concrete blocks, right? And hearing her talk about, and she was almost, embarrassed to have us looking at the back of the house, but it was also just, it wasn't fussing, right? So I think that, what's out there that isn't a fuss, I don't know. I mean, so much of the architecture that gets put up now just seems like it's glossing, right? And it's glittering. And I don't know if it's trying to strip things back so much as it is to gloss things over. Am I cynical?
Michael, any thoughts, or should I throw out the next question?
Yeah, I'll just say that what Dan's speaking about, beauty and simplicity of materials. I've kind of done a survey / got a little obsessed with branches of the Free Library of kind of the modernist era. And one of the most design-wise dramatic, but built with cinder blocks, is the Eastwick branch of the Free Library. And I wish I could remember the architect's name. I have it written somewhere, and if anybody
Bridget and John Christopher Knowles.
Yeah, there you go. Exactly. It's incredible. When I came across it, I mean, there are a number of great examples. But the variety is so widely different out of all of these kind of 1945/50 to 1977 era branches. But one thing that comes to mind is just the inexpensiveness of the materials and the variety of thought put into both the design of the exterior and the interiors. Some of the interiors are incredible just because of the amount of light that's being let in by skylights and whatnot. So
it's a good question, though. We should give more thought to that sense of idealism and expect it in our architecture. So
yeah. All right. Last question from Liz Watkiss, which thank you so much for being here, Liz. It's great to have you with us. She asks, how do you bridge the beauty gap for these two projects?
We put graffiti on the Nakashima studios.
Yeah, no, please no.
No, it's a tough question. There's something, I mean, I think a lot of us who deal with, advocacy related to modernism recognized that for, a broad audience, some of that idealism and what was being aimed at is tough to translate into the experience that people have and where they are now. Part of that is changing taste culture, it's other things. But for a lot of people, it's, at the scale of a house in a domestic space, it's more accessible and it can be a lifestyle thing, right? Which in some ways has the adverse effect of flattening out some of the kind of raw power and aspiration that's present. I mean, it's an interesting thing to look at the Nakashima studios and look at it through the photographs of Ezra Stoller, who's one of our great architectural photographers, up there with Julia Schulman and others. And you hire Ezra Stoller when you really want to, make a big impact in the press and things like that. And a lot of Stoller's photos of the Nakashima studios relate to the spaces where George was selling something, selling his furniture. And it was, so the scale and aspiration of the photography in those instances really didn't relate to living in those at the Nakashima studios, right? So Mira's house, and the only reason we didn't go in is I didn't want to, in a sense, bring people into Mira's house where she lives every day. But it's very modest, it's quite a wonderful space. And, so, it's a tough thing to offer people ways into stuff that they don't immediately have a visual connection to or a visual liking. And it, maybe the simplest thing is to say that we just have to go out and see these places, experience them for ourselves. And that's the great secret of being an architect and being in architecture school. You really often learn more from going out into the landscape and the world and experiencing them for yourselves to absorb that in their totality before you start to design or make judgments about them. So.
Yeah, I agree on the experience thought. With Pepper's, I mean, there is the graffiti that a lot of people kind of stop by for, but I think it's more and more, it is definitely a building off the beaten path and really out of, not really a part of Philly's collective consciousness when it comes to architecture. But more and more, every time I drive past or stop by, there's, more and more kids stopping by to check it out. I stopped by once and there were two girls doing selfies in the breezeway. So I think that, the more that the building's put on people's radar, and especially younger people, the more it becomes it feels less prohibitive to go and stop your car and actually walk up on the campus and see the building. And when you see it up close, because it is so monumental, your perceptions are, likely to change. You don't have to think that it's beautiful, but I think that people understand when they're standing underneath the cantilevered roof and in the breezeway is that the building really kind of has this overwhelming presence that isn't necessarily like ugly, that isn't threatening. Yeah.
So not a question, but one comment from Bob Kelly, just to note that the AIA Pennsylvania is going to be honoring the Nakashima studio at their virtual awards program being held on November 18th at 8 o'clock. And he invited everybody to join for the awards program and provided a link, AIAPA.org to sign up and check it out. But that looks like all of the questions. Yeah, I don't know if either of you have any last lingering thoughts you'd like to share before we all disperse for the evening.
Peace and brutalism.
Good one.
What he said. I would encourage everyone to go out to the Nakashima house. Definitely, it is. I've been once and it blew my mind. It was incredible. Once they reopen, once we get a handle on this pandemic. And I would encourage everyone to go check out Pepper for yourself in Eastwick, though I would not encourage you to try to go inside. Please do not trespass. But I think that you're safe to walk around the grounds and experience it for yourself. And you'll really understand the attraction of the building and the impact that the building makes in Philly's urban landscape.
Great. Well, thank you both so much for your time. And thank you again, everybody, so much for joining us tonight. It was so great to have you all with us, and we hope you enjoyed it. So if you're not already a member, we would love for you to join and get involved. So we hope to see you all soon. So thanks again, everyone, and have a great night.
Thank you. Bye-bye.